the show. I'm the host, Sean McKinnon, and today I have a special guest. I have Mason from Vertex. How you doing, Mason?
I'm doing great, Sean. Thanks so much for thinking of me and having me on your show.
All right. Well, Mason, you know already that I'm a huge fan. I love all the interviews. But I'd like to let everybody know real quick, what's the best way to get a hold of you and where can they find you?
My email and credentials and all that stuff are on the website, which is just vertexeffects.com, VertexEffects. There's a contact page there. You can get a hold of me there. But I think probably the more contemporary business card is Instagram. We're at Vertex Effects, or YouTube. If you type in Vertex Effects, I think the actual thing, because Vertex Effects was taken however many years ago when I took this, so it's Vertex Effects Inc. Inc., which is like our full corporate name. But you can find us there, and products sold all over the country at the Sweetwaters and Chicago Music Exchange and all those places in the world. Amazon as well, if you can believe it.
Fantastic, Mason. So I think you did just mention, can they buy direct from you, or do they have to use distributors?
No, we don't sell direct. We only sell through dealers and distributors, and we're sold all over the world. So you can get us, in Europe and Australia and all over Asia and stuff like that. So there should be somebody who sells them near you. If not, with the global economy, you can get it shipped to you from wherever you want.
So Mason, where are you located right now? What area are you based out of?
So I currently, where you see me sitting now, is in Oakland, California. So it's in the San Francisco Bay Area. We're on the other side of the bridge from San Francisco. However, all of our operations are in Los Angeles. So technically, the products that are made there and shipped from there. But I personally live in the Bay Area. But most of our staff is down in LA.
Oh, man. So describe for a second, those of us that are not from that area, like how far apart is Oakland to LA?
This would be about a 5-hour drive to get from the Bay Area to Los Angeles. Maybe you could make it a little faster if it was the right time of day and you were, a fast driver. You might be able to make it a little quicker than that. But it's, 350 miles or something like that.
So Mason, let's talk for a minute. Everybody knows about, these amazing interviews and your awesome company. But what about Mason? Where's Mason from? I'm watching all these interviews and I'm thinking, where's this guy come from? Where's this cat coming out of? So where'd you grow up, Mason?
I grew up all over the state of California, actually. My dad was a city manager. He worked in city government, and people are familiar with those jobs. It's kind of like for, I would say, mid to smaller size cities that don't have a strong mayor form of government, where the mayor is sort of the administrator of the city. In some of these smaller cities, the city manager is in essence the administrator of the city, and then is appointed by the city council and hired by the city council. But it's also a job that can be sort of volatile, because city council elections happen every 2 years, and once there's enough of a changeover in the city council, they may have a different direction for the type of administrator they want, whether they're pro development and redevelopment, or whether it's more of a conservancy sort of thing. And so ordinarily we would move every 2 to 6 years, depending on where we were at that time and sort of the politics of the city that my dad was working in. So we lived in Mammoth Lakes, which is a ski resort town. We lived in Carpinteria, which is a beach town in Santa Barbara County. We lived in Petaluma, which is like where Mesa Boogie is, in sort of northern California and the northern Bay Area. And yeah, we lived all over the state. So I've had a lot of different places that I've lived as a kid, and I changed high schools, in the middle of high school and all that stuff. And so it was, I guess we were used to it. I wouldn't say it was that consequential because I didn't have a comparison point. But my wife, by contrast, was like, lived in the same house her entire life and had the same friend group from kindergarten to 12th grade, and it's pretty different comparatively for me.
You almost remind me of my veteran friends. We're all veterans, my wife and I, and our sons are both in the Air Force,
Yeah,
2 out of 3 right now, and so
yeah,
like those that were raised in the military stuff, like I believe Keeley was one of my last
yeah. I think
guests.
he was too.
Yeah,
Yeah, and my parents equally, both of them. They're my mom's dad was a senior master sergeant, and in the Air Force, and then my dad's my grandfather was an officer in the Army, and so they moved. They had a similar cadence to how often they would move.
I love it. So Mason, you've been all over
Yeah.
the California area, and then you
Yeah.
got to experience that and draw from that. So where did you end up, like out of high school? What type of area were you in?
So for the first 2 years that I lived in the area of high school, I lived in a small town called Cotati, California, which is right next to where Two Rock is. And in fact, when I would take guitar lessons, I would take it in this kind of like music shop that had little studios that guitar teachers could rent from them and teach lessons. And there was also a little studio where Two Rock at the time was called K&M Analog Designs and Repairs or something like that. And when I would wait for my guitar teacher outside of his studio, I would go over and like bother Bill Crenard and like ask him questions. And so I've known Bill, who's designed the majority of the Two Rock amps since I was probably, I think we moved to Cotati in '97, I want to say. So I probably knew him a little after that, maybe a year or two after that. So I would say 90, 98, 99, something like that.
So at this point, you were taking lessons, and that is high school level, or did you grow up in a
Uh,
family with musicians or guitars around? Did you have an encouraging older brother, sister? What type of, family environment was that couched in?
yeah. I wouldn't say guitar specifically, although we took my younger brother, and I'm the oldest brother, or the oldest sibling, I should say. And we would take music lessons when we were pretty young. We started on piano, maybe around, I don't know, 7 or 8, and just kind of learn, some basics of reading music. It was mostly kind of like classical music or kind of kid stuff, that you would learn, like Wheels on the Bus and that sort of stuff.
Mel Bay.
And we continued to play piano, and then school band, like orchestra stuff, and I played drums in the orchestra. I still played piano at the same time. And then when I got into middle school, I kind of thought like those things were less cool. I like the drums, but I thought like the orchestra thing was kind of like, I don't know. To me, it was silly at the time. And so I was like, I want something that's like cooler and had more sex appeal. And so the guitar was kind of the logical transition for me. And so I started playing guitar. And at first it was just acoustic, and my parents were sort of reticent to get an electric guitar, so they kind of started me on what they thought was sort of the most benign of the guitar options, which was the Spanish classical acoustic guitar. And of course it was pretty hard to play now, like looking back, because it was a true, like, I don't remember what brand it was, but it was like, it wasn't totally budget. It was like an Alvarez or something like that, but it had like a really substantial neck that you would find on a classical acoustic guitar, and it was not that easy to play. And the type of music that I wanted to play was like really difficult to pull off on that guitar, but I stuck to it for over a year, and I think eventually we went to Guitar Center, and I got a used red Clapton Strat from the late '80s.
Did it have the lace sensors?
It had the lace sensors. Yep. It was Torino red and a maple neck, of course, and the lace sensors, and yeah, that was kind of my first real guitar.
So what type of music were you listening to growing up first, before we talk about what music interests you to play guitar? But like, I grew up and I heard ELO and all these radio bands and Steely Dan, and my dad liked country because he was from Montana, even though we were in Niagara Falls, New York. So I had the WYRK, which is still a station in Buffalo.
Nice.
But anywho, so what type of music did you hear in the background of your life?
Well, my parents had a pretty eclectic collection of LPs, and they would play a lot of music from there that was kind of ranged from Joni Mitchell to, kind of yacht rock stuff, Christopher Cross, Toto, Michael McDonald, Doobie Brothers, Earth, Wind and Fire, Steely Dan. My dad had Asia, and I think he had Gaucho, and then he had the Nightfly record. And so there was a lot of that stuff that was there. But, they were also kind of like, consequences of sort of like adult contemporary music at the time. So I'm pretty sure I remember them having like Enya and Yanni and those type of people too. And the Gypsy Kings, that was another one. Everybody had the Gypsy Kings. Those were on cassette. But I would say that they had a pretty good array of music that was in the house that ranged from a pretty good kind of stock. And they had another record. They had some compilation sort of records. Like one of them that they listened to a lot was the soundtrack for the movie The Big Chill, which had a lot of really good Motown. Like if you were going to just take a cross section of classic Motown, a lot of that was on that soundtrack. So I think that sort of helped give me a little bit more than what was sort of coming at the time. But I also like listening to pop music. I like listening to Michael Jackson. And I wouldn't say that my parents were like against that, but I don't think that they owned any Michael Jackson. I don't think, or not that I remember. I remember having Thriller on cassette, and I remember having like Mariah Carey stuff on, because I would listen to pop radio at home. And so I would tape stuff, because I had like a radio that had a cassette in it, and you could, and so you get sort of like, you'd start taping it when the DJ was kind of like introing whatever it was, and you're hoping it was something you wanted to listen to, and then you had to like shut it off if it wasn't what you wanted to listen to. So I have sort of like, I remember having these like kind of funky bootlegs of, kind of radio stuff that I've, recorded over so I could listen to it, whenever I wanted.
Was MTV still a thing when you were in high school?
Yeah, it definitely was.
Sure.
Yeah, it
I'm
was.
not sure. I was in high school in the 80s, so I'm
yeah,
dating
it
myself,
was.
Okay.
No, it definitely was. And I remember sort of like listening, you had to sort of be part of the video countdown every night to kind of like get to the one that you wanted. And see where it ended up on the countdown. And I think it was, when I first started watching that sort of stuff, because I think my parents were like afraid of us watching MTV unsupervised, because there was like Beavis and Butthead and this sort of stuff, and they were less approving of that, especially because I would have been, I don't know, like 8 or 9 years old or younger. But I definitely remember when I was really into it, like the videos that were on there would have been like Alanis Morissette, like One Hand in My Pocket, or Goo Goo Dolls.
Buffalo Band, Goo Goo Dolls.
Yeah, that's right. Those would have been kind of the type of bands that were on there, maybe like Gin Blossoms and
Hootie
stuff
and the
like that.
Gin Blossoms, all that.
Yeah, definitely Hootie and the Blowfish would have been on there. I guess that would have been right around that time. No
That's
pun intended.
cool.
I think Time was one of the songs that was on there pretty regularly. So yeah, it was kind of that era when I kind of watched MTV and was sort of starting to develop a musical taste.
Was Unplugged a thing then? I mean, the Unplugged around that era was
pretty
actually,
cool. My parents had the Eric Clapton tape, Unplugged, the Unplugged one, and I think they had a few. I think they also had like a Bryan Adams one. I think there was an Unplugged one of him. And I don't remember watching any of them like while they were happening, but I remember seeing like music video clips of them, after the fact sort of thing. But I remember it being sort of kind of like a big deal. It was sort of like the Tiny Desk concert of the era sort of thing.
That's so cool. And then lately you've even had to got to interview like the guy from Huey Lewis.
That's right. Yeah, Chris Hayes.
Man,
yeah,
it's so cool. It's so fun hearing you line them up and let them play a little bit. And all that's so neat.
Yeah.
I was definitely part of that era, so
yeah,
magical to me. So anyway, so when you started playing an instrument, and maybe let's get more specific, if you moved into guitar, did it change what you listened to? Because I know when I started picking up guitar at a late age, after I got out of the Army, excuse me, it changed everything about how I perceive music, especially guitar music. So like songs that I thought were great, I just didn't care for them sometimes, and other songs that I thought were kind of cheesy were actually very cool because now I was learning guitar. So did that ever happen to you when you started learning guitar?
Mm. I remember thinking that maybe less about how something that I might have previously liked I didn't like anymore, but more just like I could hear a song and I could say, okay, like I can I can have I have the ability now to at least attempt to learn it, whether I had the skills on my own or I got to take it to my teacher and he could show me sort of the form of it. That felt really empowering to be like, yeah, like I hear something, I'm inspired by it, and it doesn't just have to end there. I can sort of like get deeper into it and sort of learn about it and learn about the people that were involved with it, and that sort of gives me a closer understanding or a closer relationship with the music than I could have if I wasn't a guitar player. And so I think that was kind of the thing, or the way I thought about it.
Totally get it. Now, so what happened around the end of high school age? Did you go working at a shop somewhere? Did you play in some bands? Was it a little bit of both? I mean, where did you get all this knowledge and this experience? It's so interesting that I hear you talk about it on your videos.
Uh, I I started at a community college when I got out of school because when I changed. Originally, I thought I wanted to, I wanted to go to a 4-year university was always my plan. But as I mentioned, because we moved a lot, I had this challenge where I had gone to 2 years of a certain school, and they had sort of I'm trying to remember what they called it. It was like a program, like an advanced placement program, where you had a weighted GPA. And at the time, I remember it being like really, really upsetting. And so, you had a weighted GPA. So if you got a B, for example, it counted on your grade point average as an A. And this was really important for college admissions and things like that. That were in sort of the top 3 to 5% of your class. And so I remember being that in my first 2 years of high school, and then I changed high schools, and they had a different program that I think was called like International Baccalaureate or something like that, and they didn't recognize the weighted GPA that I had from the first 2 years of high school. So I think I went from having like a 4.3 GPA to like a 3.6, which was like not bad, but just kind of put me in the middle of the pack, and it was sort of irrecoverable because I couldn't. There was nothing to do. It's kind of like you had 2 years to make up. And so I kind of had come to the conclusion at that point that, I'd either have to, lower the standard of university that I was willing to go to, or go to a community college and then try to transfer in after 2 years. And that's ultimately what I ended up doing. But it was a real blessing because the quality of education at the community college that I went to, I think, was better than the 4-year university that I transferred to.
Mm-hmm.
And not only that, but you could take classes and learn about electronics, and you could learn. And there was kind of a mix of vocational skills and also technical skills. And so you kind of got to learn both of those things concurrently. Whereas when I ultimately ended up transferring to UC Berkeley, which, on paper is a great school, I kind of thought it was like, I don't know, it was fine. I knew I needed, at the time, I wanted to get a degree. And I just knew that was sort of like the best school I could get into with the grades that I had. But I would say, as far as like the experience of being in college, I thought it was kind of like, it was pretty like impersonable, and nobody knew who you were, and the professors kind of didn't give a crap, and I thought that it was the opposite when I was in community college. Like, the professors knew your name, they were invested in your success, and they really wanted you to learn. And so that was, to answer your question, is where I learned, things around how to do assembly, kind of taking vocational classes because they were training people to go into, aerospace assembly lines and stuff like that. And a lot of those skills are sort of universally transferable. Like, how do you not put stress on a loom, and how do you solder things properly, and what are the standards for this sort of stuff? And then learning something about the technical side of things, about, basics like Ohm's law and stuff like that. And it wasn't, I don't think anything that was extraordinary or that anybody else couldn't do, but it was just a good sort of foundational thing. And when I would tell professors like, hey, I'm really interested in learning to modify guitar pedals, because at that time, this was in the sort of early 2000s, Robert Keeley, whom you've recently interviewed, and Analog Man were this huge wave that people were just, kind of taken by surprise, where you didn't have to spend $200 or $300, which was a lot of money at the time, to get these boutique pedals. You could send sort of everyday effects to these different modifiers, and they would make you, in essence, a boutique pedal for a fraction of the price. But it was a little obscure, where you had to like put a money order, in the battery compartment, or put cash in the battery compartment along with the work order. And so there was a lot of parts in motion, and moving parts in order to get this thing going. And so I remember once I got into, when I transferred to Berkeley, I would put these ads on Craigslist, and I would just say, hey, like, I'll modify your pedal with the Keeley mods or with the Analog Man mods. And I don't know that I had any thought about how dignified that was or was not, but the kind of like all those all the schematics for it were, or at least what were thought to be the mods, were already published on the forums of the time. And so it was kind of known about the chips that they used, or what components they might choose to get the silver mod, or to get the fat mod for the blues driver, or whatever it may be. And so I would just do those for $30 or something like that, and that was kind of the thing that I did that sort of put me through college without having to get real jobs. And I would also play in bands, and would do cover stuff. But it was just kind of a really cool time where I was learning to do that stuff kind of, just by way of doing the work and doing repairs and stuff like that. And then going to school at the same time and playing music and trying stuff out. And that was really kind of formidable in sort of the trajectory that ultimately led me here.
It's fantastic. I thought I heard you say on one other podcast something about in your room you didn't have a lot of, in your college dorm you didn't have a lot of room maybe for a lot of stuff, so you were doing some.
Yeah,
like
I started doing amps. I started doing amps at first. Yeah, so the part I skipped over was the original Craigslist ad said amplifiers, because at the time they were easier to work on, like just spacing wise, you had more space in the chassis, and it was, at the time there were some solid state amps, of course. There weren't the same amount of like digital amps and stuff like that, which are sometimes impossible to work on, or certainly I wasn't wanting to do it. And so I was doing that, but the problem is when you're in some of the dormitories, they are pretty careful about who is coming in and out of the dormitory is one thing. And so like having some middle-aged guy like hauling a twin reverb up a flight of stairs, that looks like somebody's dad, and he's coming into my room and he's giving me cash, and it just was like not a good look from the outside. And so the main concern, or what they expressed, was like, hey, like if there's a fire, you've got all these amps here, and it's sort of like spilling over into the other person's, air space in this, communal space here. And so, you're going to have to wrap this up, And so the pedal thing was easier in that, like, I could meet them in the kind of the outdoor sort of courtyard. They could hand me the pedal. I could create a work order. They could pay me out there. Like, it didn't require them to enter into the space, and I could hold a bunch of them. So I remember buying like a Tupperware, like a shoebox Tupperware kind of thing for like boots, that was pretty big, and I would just stuff a bunch of pedals, and they were all kind of Boss and Ibanez stuff, so pretty typical sizes, and I could just slide it under the bed, and it would fit really easily. So that's kind of how it evolved over time.
That's hilarious. I love it.
Yeah.
I know Seth. We mentioned him earlier. Seth Lee Jones here in Tulsa. He don't do amps anymore. He got buzzed by one. He was working on it, shocked him. He's like, nope, no thanks.
Yeah,
I'll stick to guitars.
Yeah, it's par for the course. I think it's kind of everybody's got a story like that, where you felt it in the teeth.
Chad Mangrum says, yeah, it's just part of the It's part of the
Yeah.
thing, you know. So you definitely headed more towards the pedals then from there on out, right? So
Yeah,
let's
I never really got into amps we've done a few amps here and there in more recent years, but really it's been all pedals. It's just a lot easier, I think, and the barrier for entry is easier as well. And I think now with the direction that things are going in terms of the technology, I don't know. I think amps will continue to be a hard sell for people that are trying to break into it. Of course, there's legacy companies and companies that have spent a long time, Two Rock among them, stuff like that. Those guys will always have, I think, a good set of the subset of the amp purchasers out there that are going to want to buy their stuff. But it's a tough business to be in, and I think pedals are definitely easier in that regard, just because of the price point and that you can get a really different sound for $200 or less
and I
in some
might only
cases.
need 1 to maybe 3 amps, but I've got a plethora of pedals.
Sure.
In fact, I just bought the Fractal FM3 sitting right here.
Oh,
And
okay.
then I've got the Spark 2 sitting over here. And I had a super reverb from Drew Wynn, Guitar House of Tulsa. So Tom Bukovac and him are
Nice.
buddies and all that. And then, so yeah, and I've got the big pedal boards and the little pedal boards. But you're right. The price point is more, what's the word? The audience, you're reaching out to a lot more people with the effects, I
Yeah.
think, and so forth. But you also got into some other stuff. So let's start with the pedal thing. Let's launch off of that. You
Okay.
went from college and the pedals and the Craigslist and all that. And how many employees now do you approximately have? I mean,
We
approximately.
currently have we have a contract manufacturer,
Mhm.
so that removes a lot of the employees. So a company makes all of our stuff and does all of the management of the inventory. So that helps alleviate a lot of the employees, which in California is a tough thing. To for people that have big staffs, it can be hard to do here because I don't want to say. I would say it's unfavorable. I'd say it's unfavorable for businesses to have a big staff here just because of the way that we're structured. But I have four guys, and it's sort of a mix of people that are doing sort of the pedal side of things, and then some of them are more on the video editing and graphics side of things, and then some of them are more doing sort of social media and um, kind of maybe some customer service and repair stuff in there. So we're all pretty versatile in terms of what we do to kind of cover the ground that we need. But I think having the contract manufacturer for us is, for our style of business, has really been pretty great because they absorb so much of our operations, and finding the right ones as you grow and evolve is also like a big thing, because we've had different contract manufacturers over time, and we've been really fortunate that we've had really great ones that have been so fair with us and really helped us figure out how to grow our businesses with them, and then also kind of called it when they said, hey, like, this is exceeding what we think we can still deliver on, and then kind of helping us transition, because that's another big thing is when you move out from one and move into another, it's it's starting is that you're dating all over again, and you're learning the things that work and don't work about how to do things, and they're learning that with you as well.
Yeah, so you went
But I've
from
been really
one
fortunate.
one person, you with the pedals, right,
Yeah.
to somehow like what you're articulating right now with yeah, it's amazing how that all works. So let's connect the dot then between these two. So you were by yourself making stuff, right? Parking
Was by
lot
myself
payments.
making stuff, mostly modifying stuff, and then
Yeah,
by the time I got out of college, I got a regular job because I didn't have enough. I didn't have enough work where I could do that as a
sure.
full time job yet, and so I went to work as an elementary school teacher. I wanted to have health insurance and like things that I had kind of become
W-2.
accustomed to, and and there were, at the time, this is in 2007, there was there was a real teacher shortage, and so they were basically just like giving away teaching credentials, or making it very easy to get a teaching credential, especially if you were going to go into like a high needs school and school district. So I did that, and would be a teacher during the day and earning my teaching credential concurrently, and and I did that for 5 years, while I was also, building and modifying pedals, and I was building a lot of pedal boards, because one thing that I saw, at least in the Bay Area, is that there was really nobody that was doing that. There was a lot of people in LA that were doing this, but there really wasn't anybody outside. Even in Nashville, there really wasn't anybody. Exactone eventually filled that void, but before they came into the picture, there was really nobody. And so it kind of left this vacuum where there was a lot of people that needed work that didn't have it. And the pedal board craze was starting to really ramp up, where people would have these huge, elaborate pedal boards. And, I kind of learned how to do that. I put my foot in the water, and was able to develop a pretty steady business of just building pedal boards and having a pretty solid wait list. And that was kind of what really got me out of being a teacher.
Interesting.
And being able to start a business, just doing that full time. And then that eventually parlayed into doing some products. And most of them at first were mods, and then eventually, like, the first real product that we ever released that was fully ours was the Vertex Boost.
All right, now you mentioned Vertex. You're inserting that here. So where did you come up with the name for that? I'm always curious about that kind of. I asked my friend Colt Westbrook from Walrus, and
Yeah.
he was like, interesting question, and it's a boring story, but I'll make it short, and it was interesting. No.
Right. Well, I guess he kind of inherited it, right?
He did,
'Cause
right?
They had it from
Oxblood
there's
and
an,
all them guys or whatever. Somebody
Yeah.
that was into Mammoth, I think. Wool Mammoth. right?
Yeah. He was like
Yeah.
a part supplier. It's like a subdivision of a part
He's
supplier.
all into
called
like
Mammoth.
saber-tooth things or something. I don't know, tooth things.
Yeah.
So
So
how'd you get Vertex?
it's an equally sort of uninspiring thing. I remember looking at, trying to just like find something that I thought sounded cool, and this is again through the brain of like a 22-year-old,
Gotta come up with a name, right?
Yeah, and so I thought, I sort of like, try to get a thesaurus and come up with different names and stuff like that. And so I think I can't even remember what there was a different name that I originally had for like a week. And I think we made sort of like a really primitive website, and immediately got a cease and desist from whatever company it was, because there was another company that I had no idea existed, and they weren't really even in the same field, but they were obviously aggressive at being able to protect the name. So then I was like, all right, back to the drawing board, and there was another one that was like, oh, this is kind of could be cool as an alternative, and it was Vertex. So there's no name, or nothing about the name that was specific to, I don't know,
No engineering class. You're sitting in and learning about directional forces and vortexes and
vertices. No, there was nothing. There was nothing
We're in
like
physics
that. So
too.
Yeah, it's just kind of the name,
cool.
the name that stuck, and I don't know if
I like it.
I've surrendered that's the name, and just try to make it as cool as it can be.
Now,
with
on
what
my
we
note,
got.
I just came up with something because I'm out in Oklahoma, right? But Keeley told me the other day that his first name for his company was Oklahoma Guitars. Okay, Guitars.
Oh, nice.
Instead of Guitars, okay. This is kind of funny. So we were laughing about that.
Well, it's hard to imagine Keeley. I mean, he's got a simple enough name. It would be a little harder if it was Marangella.
I'm McKinnon, so it could have been Mac. But there's always a Mac something, So all right, so let's move along here. So obviously, what were your influences as far as your company and your vision of the company? So did you like try? I mean, we heard you talk about the mods and the Keeleys and all them, and then the pedal boards came in out of necessity, which is really cool. And then, but as far as ramping up the company, did you try to do some research and find something else, or did you just go with the flow and forge your own way?
I just went with the flow. I didn't really I just knew that kind of my attitude when I was trying to sort of determine whether I would leave being a teacher. It was really just predicated on, at the time, it was sort of like fairly low risk. My wife was also a teacher at the time, and we didn't have a family. It was just the two of us. We had pretty low expenses, and so it was sort of like if I'm going to take a risk and see if there's anything that that can come of this, this is now the time to do it. And that was why I started doing the pedal boards, and that was just sort of the thing where I had the most consistent work. I think I always had a pretty lengthy wait list of folks that had already sort of committed to having the rig built, and so I just had steady work all the time. And after a few years of doing that, the challenge became that all of the income, though, is dependent upon me being behind a soldering iron, and it's not an easy skill to teach all of the different things that are required to build a pedal board to somebody. And so I didn't really feel like I could fully delegate a lot of those parts, and I tried a few times to bring in some friends that I thought could potentially be a good fit for it, and it just didn't work out, either because I didn't have the patience at the time, or the work just wasn't up to my standard, and it just created more work for me. And I'm sure that had I stuck with it a little longer, eventually we would have gotten to that place. But I just kind of started to see the writing on the wall that like the products were the way to go, because they were just consistent and repeatable. And it's a really hard living for guys even now, when I see guys like Bradshaw and others that have been doing this forever, and they're still having to hustle, and that's a real thing. Like Bradshaw had to leave LA. He had to leave LA and move to Pennsylvania, and I know that probably finances weren't the only mitigating factor, but I think I've heard him say that was one of them. And it's sort of crazy to me that one of the godfathers of this entire field is struggling to the point where he has to relocate to the East Coast because it's just too expensive for him to be able to stay. I mean, he really pioneered so many things, and I think he said that he didn't protect his work the way he probably should have in terms of switching systems and all that stuff. And that really probably, was a huge financial loss for him. And it's not to say that he's not doing well. I have no idea. But I just, I think that it seems like if there's somebody that's deserving of having a comfortable life at this point, Robert Bradshaw's done a real service to all the pedal board makers out there.
So did you seem to learn something from his experiences, maybe? That kind of thing, as you're going through it, seeing guys ahead of you, experiencing things, and you're kind of like, maybe I should be a little proactive in this and not reactive?
I didn't actually know this. I always just assumed that he was on top of the world, and living in some mansion in Beverly Hills, and I had no idea that it was as much of a struggle for him. So it was sort of a surprise when I kind of learned more about that sort of thing. So I was just thinking of it more in terms of like a sustainability standpoint of like, could I do this if I had a family, or even if you just want to take a vacation? It's like, then you're not making any money, And so that was kind of the attitude that I had, was like, okay, well, how do we make it so that we have a repeatable process, and that you can have something that is still able to be sold and produce income, even if I'm not sitting behind the soldering iron. And so that was sort of why there was this move into becoming more of a pedal manufacturer than a pedal board builder.
So what's I think I know the answer. I think some people that have listened to a few interviews might know the answer out there. But what is the pedal that you're most particularly proud of?
Boy, it's a hard question, because I feel like at different eras of the company, they serve different purposes. So I think the Boost has just been, it's the first thing that we ever made of our own. And I'm not saying that it's the most innovative thing that's ever come out, but nobody did what that pedal does with the expression thing. And people will look at it and be like, this is dumb. Like, this is nothing, that's groundbreaking as far as like what the design did. But it was kind of like, I don't know, we were the first person think about putting ranch on pizza or something. I don't know. It's like, it wasn't that ranch hadn't existed and pizza didn't exist. It was just like putting them together. It was like, now we've got ranch on pizza.
Some of the best designs have always been that way, Mason. I mean, they
Yeah.
just filled a void, right? There's a need, and you filled it.
Yeah.
Hindsight's 2020, right?
Yeah, and so it was cool, and I've always said, it didn't come out of thin air. The development of the Boost was a consequence of, we at the time we were working very closely with the studio musician named Michael Landau, and he had asked us about taking this pedal that was new to him that he really liked, called the Vemoram Genre, which at the time was not as known as it is now. This would have been in the, right when it came out in the probably, 2010s, early 2010s. And he said, it would be cool if I could, since I have this thing on all the time, to not have a volume pedal and just be able to basically plug in an expression pedal that takes over for the volume pot of the Vemoram pedal. And in that case, it was pretty easy because all you're really doing is just tapping off where the volume pot would be and assigning that to a jack that then goes to the expression pedal. So the pot is now in the expression pedal, but there's some limitations to that because most expression pedals are a 10K pot. They're usually linear. And so the taper can be a little odd comparatively to a normal volume pedal. But in that particular circuit, it just worked. It worked fine, and he loved it. And then I remember the conversation escalating after, I don't know, a month or two of him using it and sort of liking this feature. And he said, well, is there a way to do this where it doesn't have to be predicated on being used with something that it has so much color in terms of it being an overdrive and having, a real mid-range characteristic or whatever? Couldn't it just be a super clean boost that has no color, and then the volume pedal could sort of interact with this, by plugging into it as an expression? And so then that's sort of what precipitated the design of the Vertex Boost. And so that kind of, putting in that order, and then us kind of going and figuring out how to make it. That became a really great pedal, a really useful tool, and is still like a really consistent selling product for us, and has been that way for a really long time.
Congratulations.
Yeah, so that's been great. And I would say, as far as like breaking our pedals to the world, I think that was the one. I think that the one that sort of saved us was a pedal called the Dynamic Distortion, which is based on a Maxon sonic distortion, and it's kind of this really cool distortion device which is widely misunderstood, but when used properly is just an outrageously touch sensitive and versatile pedal. And so the idea with that was to kind of make it a little bit more palatable in the way that people might ordinarily use pedals, and they don't have to know sort of like the secret, like you turn the tone knob off and you turn the volume to max and then you bring the gain down. Like, it wouldn't be intuitive for people to know that. And so it was kind of like baking in the things that need to be adjusted to kind of make it more normal for an everyday player that would just pick it up at a guitar store and wouldn't know that about it. And so that pedal was hugely important in sort of our trajectory, because sort of in the intervening time, between 2014 and 2016 or so, there was a product that we were modifying that was a wah pedal that was called an Axis wah, and it was made by Barkusberry, and we were taking that pedal and we were modifying it and then like changing the aesthetics to make it look more like a vintage wah and then reselling it. But we weren't saying that, one, we were getting it from Barkusberry, two, the sort of the nature of the mods, and that it was still kind of based on this platform. And as a consequence of that, eventually, as people started to tinker with it, which they should and is expected, they made the connection that this was coming from this much lesser priced pedal. And when confronted with that, as this, mid 20-year-old who was trying to build a business. I was like, well, we're just gonna obfuscate this, and we're just gonna let it die a slow death. And of course, terrible choice. It got more and more momentum, and eventually, I'm there sort of backtracking and saying like, yeah, I lied about this, and it was this, it's actually this product, and this is what we were doing to it, and I'm really sorry and embarrassed, and what I can offer you is a full refund. I can offer you, if you like the pedal and you're just upset about the fact that you were deceived in sort of the marketing of this, that will give you back whatever the difference was between what you paid and what the actual cost of the product from Barkasberry is. Or you can do some combination of thereof. Some people were like, well, I want to exchange it for a boost, and then you just give me back the difference. And so kind of the restitution options were open to everybody. But as you can imagine, we had a few hundred of these that were made at the time that this happened. And a lot of them sold through dealers and stuff like that. So, we were getting them back at sort of a fraction of the price, and had to, give them back, 30% maybe more than what we said sold them for originally. So it took a few years for that to be able to be kind of resolved with the full amount of people that were affected by that, sort of terrible choice that I made. And we still leave the door open, by the way, if anybody's listening to this and they're like, hey, I got one of these Access wahs and I didn't know about this. You can head over to our website, and there's a whole section that says wah redemption. You can go there and you can just say, hey, I got one of these wahs. Here's a serial number. What are my restitution options? And we'll give you the same options that we gave everybody else, and you can pick what works best for you. But that's all to say that, we were pretty much radioactive at that point in the industry. And there had been a lot of things that had happened concurrently, or concurrent to that. There's a guitar company that had sort of done something where they had taken hundreds of thousands of dollars. I don't know what the amount was, maybe tens of thousands of dollars. I'm probably, prone to hyperbole just because of how I think of the time in my mind, but had taken all this money in deposits and basically closed up shop and disappeared. And I think that sort of that got collapsed with it. And there was another brand, which I don't remember the name of, and they were sort of taking a pedal that was from China and repackaging it and selling it for more money. And so there were sort of these examples of companies that had done this and kind of just disappeared off the face of the earth. And my intent was like, listen, I might not survive this. And I was kind of surrendered that, the thing that I had built and that I had been so careful about up until that time, that it was a terrible decision, and I got to live with the consequences. And my thought was, okay, well, I'm going to do everything that I can to repay people and get people back to whole again, and even if that's injurious to me, if I need to go out of the industry, I want to do it as cleanly as I can, and at least say, hey, you know what, I screwed up, but I was able to give everybody their money back or give them whatever restitution option they felt was fair. And it was surprising to me that despite, being hated by a lot of people, and still to this day, based on that choice, that people were willing to give me a second chance, and people were willing to buy boosts, and people were willing to still give me a chance. And I don't know if that's because they weren't really aware of the full story of this, or whether they thought that the way it was dealt with was respectable and they still wanted to give me a second chance. I don't know. But the dynamic distortion in terms of saving the company, when I started to make that, I think I started with maybe only a few hundred units, and we did some cool videos with some players that I knew that were kind of popular on YouTube and Instagram at the time. And we had, some cool videos with Mason Stoops, who's a really fantastic guitar player. And we had some videos with another player named Nick Mayberry, who could really kind of do like the Hendrixy Stevie Ray Vaughan thing. And some friends of mine who owned a studio let us use that for free to make some content. And my videographer friend did me this solid and said, hey man, I'll shoot a bunch of videos for you for a few $100, because I know the budget is tight for this. And we were running some, small Facebook ads for $5 a day. And we started selling hundreds of those pedals, and that kind of was able to get us where we were kind of clear of all kind of the lion's share of any of the refunds, or at least the ones that were known to us at the time. And of course, like, few came in here and there, in years to come. This is going back almost 11 years ago. But that kind of brought us back to life, and dealers were contacting us and saying we were interested in carrying the brand again, and things of that nature. And so that was kind of the pedal that sort of helped us rebuild. And then the next pedal that came out after that was called the Steel String Clean Drive, and that was sort of based on sort of the sound of a clean Dumble amplifier and EQ and sort of dynamic range. And then that was a huge seller for us, and that kind of catapulted us even further, and that got us in with Sweetwater, and then that sort of added another sort of growth level. We came out with the Ultraphonics, which is sort of an overdrive section of a Dumble amplifier, and that kind of continued to grow. So sort of each of them are sort of responsible at sort of elevating or sort of making a comeback for the brand with each successive release. And so, if I had to say one, I think I would say the Vertex Boost, is because it kind of got us on the map. But I would say each successive one has had a really huge impact. And then I think of the most recent devices, our buffer is kind of like, it's such an uncool pedal for everybody to have a buffer, but it's such an important pedal to have, and it sort of ensures that every device on the board is sort of maximized as a consequence of treating the elements that sort of come into the pedal board and the elements that come out of the pedal board, to ensure that those are sort of coming to the table with the cleanest, purest signal possible, and leaving things as unaffected as possible, despite running through these elaborate signal paths that many of our pedal boards have. So they've all served their purpose, to answer your question, sort of helping build the brand and bring it back.
I love it. Mason, thanks for your transparency on that. It's really interesting. Sure. Yeah, man, I love it. I was telling you something earlier, something I tell my kids. I used to teach and coach and all that. So it's problems aren't the problem. It's how we handle the problems that make the difference. What are some common misconceptions guitarists have about their signal chain or pedal board setup that you often encounter?
Good question. I think the biggest ones that are recurring things have to do with buffers being one of them. I think that we're still learning as a community how to differentiate between good and bad buffers. And I think the growth area is that at least buffers are now part of the conversation. For many years, there wasn't a lot of understanding of that term at all. Now we're starting to understand it more, and that it is an important thing. And I think that the next evolution is sort of being able to discern what's good and what's bad. And I think in the same way that we have learned as a guitar community about what type of overdrive sounds that we tend to gravitate towards as guitar players, and I think there's a more narrow array of overdrive pedals that most overdrive pedals are based on, because of sort of the likes and desires of guitarists. Like, we see a lot of blues breakers, we see a lot of tube screamers, we see a lot of nobles, we see a lot of the original Marshall governors and things like that. So there's kind of a somewhat limited range with which we're all sort of putting our take on, but we're still all sort of coming back to certain devices. And I think in buffers, I think I'd like to see, or I'm hoping that through maybe our videos and videos that other people are doing, that we start to have this understanding of, like, just because you have a buffer doesn't satisfy the quality of it. And so it would sort of be like, the analogy that I use is like, if you say, well, I don't need a Clon Centaur because I already have an overdrive. And it's like the fallacy of, like, well, if you have an overdrive, then it's a Clon Centaur. And it's like, we know that that's not true, right? A Clon Centaur has a specific sound, and a certain thing that it does. And if you have a tube screamer, it's not really going to give you the sound of a Clon, and so they're kind of different sounding overdrives. And I think equally with buffers, a lot of people say, well, I have this Boss tuner up front, so I'm good, is it true to a degree that having a Boss buffer is better than no buffer? Probably in most cases that's true. but there's a range that exists within that, and that's sort of at the bottom of the totem pole, so to speak. And so I think that that this is something that we need to kind of get more education on. And I'm slowly trying to sort of beat people over the head. And I know that some people in our comments when we do buffer videos are like, God, again, another buffer video. And that's kind of how we need to do it, though, because it's something that is largely misunderstood, and it's not an easy thing to sort of separate in your mind of how it all works and what it's actually doing in the signal path. Another one that comes up really commonly is sort of a misunderstanding between current and voltage. A lot of people will say, I have this power supply and it says it's got 500 milliamps, but my pedal says it only takes 100 milliamps, so I can't use this. And it's like, no. As long as the current is that the pedal requires is less than what the supply puts out, it will only use what it needs. But voltage, on the other hand, you don't want to say, here's 18 volts, I got a 9-volt pedal, it's only going to use what it needs. No, that is not true. And so voltage, you need to match 1-to-1, but current, as long as the pedal draws less than what the supply provides, that's great. And then maybe some understanding about linear versus switch mode power supplies is another thing that I think people could get into and start to learn more about. And to kind of just 30-second abbreviated sort of talk on this without giving you a full TED talk on power supplies is basically the old school power supplies that many of us used for a long time, like the Pedal Power 2, that's called a linear supply. It uses a transformer in order to sort of generate all the power and then sort of distribute that out to all these isolated outputs, and each little output is its own thing, and those are great. However, they turn out not to be as great with today's pedals because we've graduated to super high current pedals with a lot of demand for power. And in order to produce that amount of power with the old school linear style supplies, they need to be a lot bigger, they need to be a lot heavier, and they need to be made out of materials that help dissipate all the extra heat, which is not so good when you're putting pedals under, or putting a pedal train board together. You have power supply underneath it, and then you put all these pedals on top of these transformers that are inside of the power supplies. It can create a real noise issue. And so the way that we've sort of gotten around this is we've moved to switch mode power supplies, which don't have the same sort of typology as the linear supplies, and using the C core or R core transformers, or the torque rate transformers that they use in the old like Voodoo Lab stuff. And this is really cool in that it does a few things. It allows you to be able to use the power supplies anywhere, so they can adjust the voltage depending on whether in Europe or wherever it is, or Japan, wherever you might be. But also they can produce a lot more power in a lot smaller size box. And they kind of got a little bit typecast as being noisy. And it is true that they can be noisier if they're not optimized for audio applications, because a lot of people would take an old camera charger that was 9 volts and happen to have the right barrel size and would plug it into their pedal, and it would make it really noisy because the camera doesn't need to worry about high frequency noise, when it's being used, because you're not usually charging your camera in the wall as you're using it in most cases, unless maybe it's a video camera or something like that. And so anyway, there's not really an audio component to some of those supplies, but the ones that are coming out by Strymon and by Chalks and even Voodoo Lab now has a line of switch mode power supplies. They're all really excellent, and they're lightweight, and again, they have a lot more power. You don't have this concern about where you put them in causing noise or any issue or interference with the transformers. So we've kind of moved on as an industry over to switch mode power supplies, but I would just say to anybody that is in the market for it, I wouldn't go for a linear power supply anymore. If you're using contemporary pedals, it's just so much easier, and just the power that they provide and the quality of the supplies is just as good as it's ever been.
Let's talk about the current state of the effects industry.
Okay.
So, from your perspective, has the guitar effects industry evolved over the past few years? I think you were just alluding to some of it.
Yeah.
And so what are some of the biggest changes you've seen since you were making them in the dorms, or modding them in the dorms, to right now?
Well, the multi-effects stuff have just become better and better. When I was in college, the big one was the Line 6, the DL4, and that whole series of mod pedals and distortion and delay and all that stuff. Those were huge, and they still kind of hold up now. When you play a DL4, and I've played one fairly recently, they still sound really good, and they did a really great job on that whole series of effects. But then Strymon kind of was born out of that Line 6 stuff, and they've kind of really taken over, I think, in as far as sort of more boutique modeling effects. But I would say that the biggest trend that I've seen is that there's a lot more people that are entering into the industry. Maybe it's slowed down a little bit subsequently, just because it's become competitive, more competitive because of that, and it's hard to maybe break through the noise. I think in terms of sort of the way that people buy effects now, it's quite a bit different too. I think in the old days, dealers were more specialized, so you could only get Keeley from certain people, or you could only get Vertex from certain people. And now I think the change has been that you can get everything from everybody. And I don't know, I don't want to just say that it's a bad thing, but I think it's changed sort of the dynamic where dealers don't create great content about individual brands in the same way that they did when, let's say, Pro Guitar Shop was around, as an example. Is that if you were in that store, you were getting content created about your pedals and your brand that were getting seen by a really large kind of cross-section of the industry, because that was kind of the main demo game in town. Maybe you had that. Maybe you had Pete Thorne. There was another guy early on named Greg V that would do a lot of stuff that were kind of along those lines, kind of more product demo-based stuff. But there weren't as many players as there are now on YouTube that are doing reviews, and dealers are not really doing many reviews in that regard. Some are, but I would say mostly not, and they're looking to sort of piggyback off of the content that's created by the manufacturers. And so I think that the dynamic shift kind of happened when they have to compete with Amazon, and they have to compete with some of the other dealers that kind of did this. Like I think Pro Guitar Shop kind of ultimately became like that, where they kind of ended up carrying everybody. There was another company called Primax that I think started to carry everybody. I think both of those companies are now gone. But I think that was sort of the game that dealers started playing, and I think it's kind of an unsustainable game now. And I wonder if there's going to be a shift back to maybe more specialization in terms of dealers that make it so that they can develop a clientele for themselves and kind of build around certain brands that they push more than others. But I think the other big thing is that everything is kind of going the way of digital modeling in the amp world, and that's why I mentioned I think amps are a really hard industry to get into right now, because the infrastructure is changing, and that's not all because people hate amps. I think it's more because the demands that they have at the venues that they play or the artists that they work with are no longer tolerating the inconsistency or the variability of a tube amp. Or the volume of a tube amp, or if it's all in ears, then it can also be really hard to be able to make these distinctions between tube amps and modeling amps, and so it sort of has become the path of least resistance. And I think that we're going to see a lot more players in that space in the coming years that are doing a lot of modeling or doing sort of the hybrid stuff, like what you see Friedman doing right now or Tone King doing right now, where you've got a 12AX7 stage in the front, and then you've got power amp modeling and speaker modeling with XLR outs. I think that that's going to be probably the future that you see a lot of different companies moving towards, especially those that are doing amps. And I think that pedals, it'll always kind of be a revolving door. I think the players that have kind of made pedals that have made their mark on the industry are probably going to, be around in some way, shape, or form. But I think the ones that I think you've seen a lot more pedal companies moving into doing YouTube and moving into doing more social media where they really haven't been historically. And I think Josh at JHS is a big part of that, and Brian Wampler I think is a big part of that. And I think you've seen companies like them that have been around a long time and have been able to continue to galvanize fans and supporters. And I think that they're doing that by creating relationships with them through videos. And I think that that's a hugely important thing to continue to keep your brand relevant and alive and in front of people that are buying pedals. And I think that they understood that. And I think more companies are starting to learn that as well, even though they're a little late to the party. I think that they're gonna be pivoting to that too, and you're gonna see more and more content creation from a lot of these brands.
So as we transition here, I do want to talk about your interviews real quick.
Okay.
So the interviews that you've been doing are just incredible, man. I mean, come on, name a few of your favorite guys that, not one, but just name a few just offhand. We were talking about Ray Parker Jr., right?
Yeah, Ray Parker Jr. is great. I think the ones that have been sort of the biggest ones have been sort of accident. One of them was accidental, which was with Wendy Melvoin. I think that's the biggest one we've ever done. It's got several million views from Prince, and the Revolution. And that was sort of what kicked off this whole interview thing. And it was never really intended to be a series. It was like I had made her this pedal board. She was coming to pick it up from our studio in LA. And I was just going to ask her to kind of like, as a means to have her demonstrate some of the capabilities of the board, I was going to sort of anchor it in songs that I knew that she played on. And so that was kind of what became the format, or what got built into the format of what the series is called The Guitarist Behind, and it's on the Vertex Effects YouTube channel. But that one just, I don't know, just like blew up huge, and it was sort of unexpectedly. And then I think the second one that we did was with Paul Jackson Jr., and equally, like that one, we were still kind of getting our sea legs as far as what the form was of the interview. And, if you watch that interview, I don't think I talk for like the first minute or something, like, because Paul just interjects and is just sort of ingratiating me with all of these like compliments and telling everybody about, why this is so great. And he almost sounds like he's, like a preacher, or something like that, and he proceeds to play through all these hits that he played on with Michael Jackson and all these others that you'd recognize. And then the next one was like Dean Parks. And so I think like the first three that we did all got over 1 million views, or 2 or 3.
Incredible.
And that kind of launched it. And then, it's been really cool to get to talk to my other guitar heroes like Dan Huff and Michael Thompson are kind of two of the biggest guys that, I just adored their parts and their playing, and it was just like a dream. It was like really, like when I was a kid and I was looking at my parents' like record collection and listening to that stuff, or being inspired by a guitarist, I always imagine how it might have gone down, that they would have been, how it would have been with them in the room. And so it's really special to be able to like actually have, to the degree that it can be recreated, and that, I can be in the room and hear it kind of happening in the moment. Like that is just the coolest thing. Like that's the best part of the interview, asking questions sometimes for myself, because I just want to know, like, what gear did you use for that? Or like, how do you get this sound? And having them elaborate. But more than that, just like, hearing them play these guitar parts that like sometimes you can't even tell, like they're so buried in some cases. So having them really brought up in the mix and having them, really demonstrate, it's really cool to kind of see all that stuff happening in real time. So those have been a couple that have been really great. Another one that I really love that I recently did, it hasn't come out yet at the time that we're recording this, was with Keith Scott from Bryan Adams. And that was really cool. Another one I worked on for a long time and took forever to locate him. And it was with Chris Hayes of Huey Lewis and the News. That took 2 years, of
Wow.
asking
Holy
people, trying to
cow.
locate him, figuring out where he was. And I'll tell a funny story, which I don't know that I've told any this publicly, but it's just a hilarious story of how this ended up coming to be. So Chris is from the Bay Area. And his brother lives in a nearby city and is a drummer and plays with Robert Cray and another blues guitarist named Matt Schofield quite a bit locally. And his sister Bonnie lives in the area, and we've got a bunch of sort of mutual friends, but kind of none of them either felt comfortable either making that introduction or kind of like wasn't really sure what my intentions were, because I guess Chris is pretty private. And so, it was just difficult to get an endorsement locally for somebody to like connect me. My parents live in San Diego County and have retired there, and they live on a private golf course that Huey Lewis also lives on certain times of the year. And my dad, I'd just seen my parents recently, and my dad kind of said, "Well, who are you working on now? Who's somebody?" And I explained to him, "I'm really trying to get this Chris Hayes guy. He played with Huey Lewis in the News." And my dad's like, "Well, I see Huey sometimes at the gym or at the bar, and so, if I see him, I'll he doesn't really hear very well because he's got Meniere's disease, but if you get him on a good day, he can, you can communicate with him." So my dad happened to see him in the gym, like the next day
Oh
or
my
2 days
God.
after we had this conversation at the country club.
Incredible.
And he just goes over and he talks to him, and
Go,
I think at
Dad.
first Huey thought he was asking for me to interview him, and then eventually came to understand that it was Chris that I was interested in interviewing. And he said to my dad, he's like, "Well, give me your son's email, and I'll send it to my secretary, and my secretary will forward this proposal to Chris. So have your son write a proposal, and give it to you, and then I'll forward it on to Chris. And then if he decides to contact you, great, And if not, I did the best I could do, and my dad calls me from the gym, and he's like, "Hey, he said this," and I was like, "Well, I already have the proposal. I've had it for 2 years, and I'm just, didn't know who to send it to." So I sent it to my dad, and then Huey takes my dad's phone, types in his secretary's email, sent it off, and like 2 hours later, I get a phone call from Chris.
Oh my God, that's incredible.
Yeah,
That is
yeah,
so incredible. What do they say?
yeah.
We're like 6 degrees from each other. It's
Yeah,
like you just.
yeah.
It's like,
So yeah, that was
that's so
the
cool.
kind of
I
the most
love it.
fortuitous of all of them.
Now, as we move along here, so we'll wrap this up here pretty soon. What type of future products do you want to give away? Do you want to talk about anything? Are you looking at any more pedalboard stuff, more guitar effects, chords? What are you looking at right now for the future of the company?
Yeah, I think that the future, as I mentioned, is kind of going to really be more in the modeling space. So we're making some products right now. We're developing some products that are kind of more addressing, not necessarily making modeling stuff ourselves. It's not really within my skill set either to do that. So it's a different skill set altogether, and so it would have to be contracted if we were going to have digital modeling stuff. But right now, the challenge that I see is that people are having a hard time getting the feel right for a lot of the modeling stuff. And it can sound really close, especially in playback or on monitors or in in-ears, where the element of feel is somewhat already removed, even if it were a real tube amp. And so what we're trying to do is figure out some solutions to sort of get back some of that stuff. So kind of creating a tube stage that would exist in front of your modeling amp or your amp sim that would just give you the feel and response and sort of percussiveness of a real 12AX7 gain stage that's neutral and can really be paired with anything that you want, whether you're going into an Axe Effects or you're going into a UA Dream or you're going in to a HX Stomp or whatever it is. There's just certain things, the inconsistencies and the irregularities that make tube amps the desirable thing that they are, that's really difficult to model with X's and O's, and so we're trying to create something that's really simple, that can deliver the right voltage to the tube where it's actually doing something and not just ornamental, but is workable in a pedalboard context. Stereo in, stereo out, and is compact as it can possibly be given the parameters of what it is that we're doing. So that's something that we're working on. The real challenge, as you've, I'm sure, been hearing and people have been talking about, is tariffs. And right now, the challenge is for every manufacturer, even if you're US based, is all of our parts, the infrastructure for all of our parts exists overseas. And it's just not something that is even in existence here. Like if you're buying from an American company, they too are importing from overseas, and you're just buying the inventory here, but it was made over there. And this is fairly consequential because of if just to use easy, round numbers for the math, if your pedal costs $50 at market, let's say, the typical math, the way that most of us structure our pricing is we do 4x our cost. So if it's $50 at market, it's going to cost $200, or $199.99. And the reason that there's this calculus is that you've got to build in price differences for distributors, which is usually 50% or more off of that price, and dealers that are, between 30 to 45% off that price. And so you're building in these margins so that you can afford to sell it below what the street price is. And I think often the consumers are seeing $199.99 and they think that that's all profit. And usually on a $200 pedal, you would be lucky if you clear $30, like something like that. And in some cases less, depending on which type of dealer or distributor you sell it to. And the challenge now is that if you have a $50 pedal, the most expensive individual piece, like of any one piece, is probably labor. But on a $50 pedal, that might be $10 or $12 of the cost. And then the remaining, $38 is parts for the enclosure and the foot switches and all the pieces of the circuit board and all the ribbon wires and stuff like that. So if that is subject to a 50% or greater tariff, it's still the majority of the cost of the pedal has risen by 50%. And so this makes it now where our $200 pedal is now like $200 or $300 pedals at market when we're having to build in those tariffs. And we don't want to increase prices on customers, and dealers certainly don't want us to increase prices on customers because they know it's harder to sell a $300 pedal than it is to sell a $200 pedal. And so until there is a trade agreement worked out, it's kind of speculative as to how much something is going to be priced at, because when I order a batch of parts, let's say I order 1,000 foot switches from Taiwan or from China, I'm not billed when they ship them. I'm billed for the tariffs when they arrive. Like I pay the manufacturer in real time when they ship. But then when they arrive, it's sort of a blank check because it could be 50%, or if it's kind of how it was a few months ago, 150%, you're on the hook for whatever that is. And so that's where it becomes really, really scary for brands to think about, okay, well, what do I do if I'm sitting on all this inventory that I've overpaid for, and now my net, instead of $30 a pedal, is $5 a pedal? Like I can't run a business and support my payroll on that. And so this is something that is kind of, I think, been a challenge in the current state that we're in, of not having this sort of resolved is a real question mark, I think, for manufacturers. So I'll get back to to making that pedal, but at this point, kind of getting it to knowing when there'll be an actual manufacturing of it, I'm not sure, because to us, it doesn't make sense for us to not order bulk parts and all this different stuff, but it also doesn't make sense just to sell it for less than what it costs to make. So that's the challenge.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's interesting, actually. And have you ever had any inkling to do what like UA is doing and having online you could download certain patches and different things like that? Have you delved into that?
I haven't thought about it,
Okay.
but and mostly it's because I wouldn't even know where to start. Like
Right.
again, it would just be like
Right.
somebody hiring it out or contracting with a plug-in company to do it, which
Yeah, plugins, yeah.
we've seen Rock has done, and that's great. It's just no, we haven't done that, and I wouldn't be opposed to it, but
Interesting.
those certainly are great in terms of, once it's built, there's no overhead,
All right, so we're gonna wrap up here, and then we're gonna do a quick fire real fast, and I'll let you go, man.
All right.
So wrapping up, first off, I want to say thank you so much, Mason.
Sure.
Appreciate it. Really appreciate it. And once again, I'll put everything up here on the screen so people can see like where to get a hold of you and the socials and all that kind of good stuff. And if you have a link tree or anything like that, we'll drop it in there. And I do want to say thank you for all the subscribers and everybody that's out there, clicking the likes and hitting comments, because it's free to subscribe, right? Like Tom Bukovac says, if you don't like my show, well, it's free. But it does help the algorithm. For my end of the show, hitting the likes, leaving a comment, the algorithm thinks it's like important because people are interacting with it. So I just want to encourage people to leave a comment for Mason, myself, and it'll just help the show. So do you have anybody you want to give a shout out to real quick as you're wrapping up, and then we'll do the quick fire round?
Well, thank you to you, Sean, for thinking of me and having me. And, again, there's been a lot of people that have been responsible for, kind of getting me to the place that I am, including, my team, my core team of guys that have been with me forever. Gabriel, another Mason, if you can believe it, Hunter, have all been really instrumental in getting us where we are. And then, two of the biggest influences on me for kind of getting me, somewhat ready to enter the industry, or Pat Brennan, an amazing technician and engineer, and also Gene Brand, also amazing technician and engineer. So those were kind of the mentors that got me to where I am, and what I've become.
Awesome. And maybe your wife and your dad for getting that interview.
Yeah, my dad for sure for getting that interview.
Go, man. I'm a grandpa now, so I get it.
Certainly
man.
my wife for tolerating all of the long nights,
I love it. All right, here we go. So Mason, welcome to this fast quick fire round. Now, I'm a soccer guy. So I watch European soccer, Liverpool and Glasgow Celtic, and they have something called stoppage time, which is just extra time added on to normal time. So this is kind of like stoppage time. So are you ready, right, Mason? Here we go.
I'm ready.
All right, tube screener or Klon?
Tube screamer.
Ooh, analog or digital, and why?
Analog. It's just the way that God intended.
I love it. All right, your favorite non-Vertex pedal?
Let me look at my board right now. It changes from time to time.
Go for it. I get that.
I'm going to say the Providence SOV1.
We'll put that up.
Providence SOV1. Yep.
Nice. Now, one piece of gear you can't live without besides a guitar.
An amplifier.
Computer.
Deluxe reverb. Deluxe
reverb. There you go. Your dream collaboration, either an artist or another pedal builder.
In terms of like
working
like professionally speaking, or like an interview.
Professionally speaking.
Collaboration. I'm just gonna put this out here, Robert Keeley. I think we take two of the best boosts that were ever made, the Keeley Katana and the Vertex boost, if I could be so bold as to say. And he's got those 2-in-1 pedals.
Yes.
And what if we had it?
Oh.
You could do them pre-post. You could swap them. You could have the expression. Could be a cool 2-in-1.
I love it. You heard it right here, Robert. All right, now a couple more here. Your personal desert island Vertex pedal.
Just one.
Yep. Who's your favorite child?
Yeah, right.
The boost?
Well, I think the boost. I don't think the boost, only because it'd just be louder. I think I'd probably go Ultraphonics Mark II.
Nice.
Have a little overdrive just to kind of give you a little bit of a different sound than what the amp on its own produces.
All right, last question for you is the Desert Island albums. You can name 3. What would be your 3 Desert Island albums? Come on.
That's a good question. I feel like it's always different.
Right.
Or some months I'd give you a different answer.
Fair enough.
I think Thriller is one of them for sure. I think this may be controversial amongst the Steely Dan fans. Oh, maybe not. I think Gaucho.
Yes.
Gaucho. I think Gaucho to me is, even though I love Asia, I feel like Gaucho just is more my speed. If I had to listen to it over and over again. I'm just trying to think of stuff that I've listened to, like back to, or like, listen to the whole thing through. All right, Steve Winwood, Back in the Highlife.
Oh man, good call, Mason.
Yeah,
awesome.
I think those are the three.
Wow, that's fantastic, man. That's such a good. Yeah, I like it, man. I'm with you. I'll be jamming with those, man.
Yeah.
Instead of yacht rock, you got island rock.
Right.
And don't tell Rick Beato that we call it that, because he is not happy with yacht rock.
Oh well.
Some of them cats
it's
don't
kind of
like
bigger
the
than
labels.
him. It's too big to fail.
I love it. All right, Mason, I'm gonna let you go with the rest of your day, brother, and I appreciate it
Thank you,
so
Sean.
much, man.